Good morning. It's a little past time for us to begin our Bible class, but we get involved in fellowship with one another, and it's hard to break that up. But it's good to see you. It's good to have you here with us. We're studying from the book of Hebrews, and we are in Hebrews chapter 12 this morning. We're closing in on the end. I think we'll probably finish Hebrews before Jacob finishes Life of Christ, maybe. I don't know. You're going to start asking a lot of questions? Yeah. Um, we were wondering which one of us was going to finish first. I was on Exodus and he was on Life of Christ, and I finished Exodus, and now I'm almost done with Hebrews. But it's been a good study, and a lot of the things that we've seen in the book of Hebrews have to do with the fact that Jesus is better, that Jesus is superior, and because Jesus is better, we need to hold fast to our Christianity. We need to continue to be faithful as Christians. The Hebrews writer is writing this to Jews who have become Christians, who looks like they're tempted to go back into Judaism in order to escape some of the persecution from the Jews, that it might be easier for them to go back to Judaism or practice some tenets of Judaism. And so he makes a point through this letter of talking about how everything that we have in Christ is better than what they had in Judaism. So why would you want to go back to that? Why would you want to? And as a matter of fact, it's growing old. It's becoming obsolete. It's vanishing away, as the Hebrews writer says in Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 13. But we had gotten into Hebrews chapter 12, where we're looking at this section that deals with the passage that the Hebrews writer pulls from the book of Habakkuk. My righteous ones shall live by faith. And we had all those heroes of faith in chapter 11. And then when we get to chapter 12, he says, look to Jesus. Consider the example also of Jesus, who didn't give up. And in coming back to this theme, as we'll see here in this section of Hebrews 12, the Hebrews writer is going to be bringing up some stuff that he's already talked about earlier in the letter. He's making a summary here. He's kind of winding up this sermon, and it looks like it's a sermon more so than a typical epistle or letter that we see in the New Testament. And so beginning here in the section that we were in Hebrews chapter 12, beginning in verse 18, he's going to make a comparison about them, right, back in their day, in the time of Moses, when they came to Mount Sinai, and us today. And so he says in verse 18, you have not come to the mountain that may be touched, and that burn with fire into blackness and darkness and tempest, and the sound of a trumpet, and the voice of words, so that those who heard it begged that the word should not be spoken to them anymore. For they could not endure what was commanded, and if so much as a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned or shot with an arrow. And so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I am exceedingly afraid and trembling. We talked about this last week, that the mountain that they came to, right, it shook, it quaked, it had thunders, it had lightnings, it had smoke and fire on it. And the people were afraid. We looked at where this occurred back in the book of Exodus, chapters 19 and 20, and they were scared, and they were afraid. And they heard God speak to them from the mountain, and they said to Moses, don't let God talk to us anymore, or we're going to die. They were frightened. They were afraid. And God basically scared them on purpose because he wanted them to not sin. And so if they were afraid of him, then that would be a good way of getting them to not sin. Sometimes we lose that fear of God, I think, in our lives, because we can commit sin and nothing happens to us. And we commit sin and nothing happens to us, and we think, well, we're getting away with it. Well, they were frightened when they heard the voice of the Lord there, and so they were scared about that. And so there was a lot of shock and awe, if you will, that was going on. And he says, but we have not come to that, right? So they came to some physical place, and they saw the awesomeness of God. They didn't want God to speak to them anymore. But we've got something better. We've come not to a physical place, not to a physical mountain that quakes and shakes and has smoke and fire and all. We haven't come to a physical place. We've come to a spiritual place. And that's the contrast that the Hebrews writer is making here. He says, so we have not come, right? Notice that in verse 18. You have not come to this. They did. But in verse 22, he says, but you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn who are registered in heaven, to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of just men made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling that speaks better things than that of Abel. And so he gives us a list here of what it is that we have come to. And we started going through this last week. We've come to Mount Zion, right? So what was impressive at Mount Sinai is even more impressive for us at the spiritual place that we are at Mount Zion, right? We didn't have prophets like Moses be able to deliver the word to us. We heard what it is that Jesus spoke. We have written for us what it is that Jesus spoke. Right? In these last days, God has spoken to us by his Son. And so we haven't come to this physical place, but we've come to a spiritual mountain, to the city of the living God. And we talked about how Abraham and Moses, they were looking for a reward. They were looking beyond. They were looking for a city whose maker is God, back in Hebrews chapter 11, I think it's verse 10, that Abraham was looking for a city whose maker was God, who was made with hands, right? And so they were looking for that heavenly city. So to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. Now, I mentioned this last week, but when you look at this list, to identify the items on the list, look at that little word "to," right? You have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God. The heavenly Jerusalem is a description of what the city of the living God is. So he's talking about the heavenly Jerusalem. So he's not talking about an earthly city. He's talking about our heavenly home, right? The city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. Two, and so we got a third thing on the list, an innumerable company of angels. And as I mentioned last week, when we get to verse 23, that general assembly, that to me looks like it ought to go with the angels there in verse 22. He's talking about an innumerable company of angels. When we talk about the word that's there is where we get the word myriad from, right? Myriad. What does myriad mean? Many, a lot, right? You might say a plethora. That probably doesn't help you any, but it's a lot, right? And in the book of Revelation, in chapter 5 and verse 11, it talks about 10,000 times 10,000 and thousands and thousands. And so here he references it as an innumerable company of angels. And that general assembly that is there, sometimes we might think, well, that's the church. Well, no, because the church is the next thing. The church of the firstborn is the next thing. And so I think the two really goes with the church of the firstborn. That general assembly ought to go with what's at the end of verse 22, because that the word that's translated there is a word that means a festive gathering. And so what's he talking about? He says, well, we've come to an innumerable company of angels who are in a festive gathering. They're in celebration. Well, why would the angels be in celebration?
Children come out, the celebrations go out, sinners repent.
Because of sinners repenting, right? Because of the children come home. Because when one sinner repents, what is there in heaven? Rejoicing, right? And so you see, we've come to an innumerable company of angels who are rejoicing. Why? Because we've chosen to accept God's salvation. We've chosen to accept God's grace. And when lost sinners are saved, right, there's rejoicing that goes on. And so we haven't come to some physical place where we're going to have a temporary, because their celebration there at the mountain, when they received the word of God, how long did that last? How long were they faithful to it, right? How long? And so what we have is better if we're faithful, right? We've got to remain faithful as well. And so that general assembly is a festive gathering there with regards to the angels that are in this festive gathering. We've come to the church of the firstborn. Right now, this isn't talking about the firstborn as Jesus, because he gives further description here who the firstborn are. The church of the firstborn who are registered in heaven. Brian talked about this in his devotional lesson on Wednesday night. The fact that our names are registered in heaven. If we've been saved, right? If we are one of God's, then he has put our name in his book of life. And our names are registered in heaven. That here we are pilgrims and strangers, but we're looking forward to that heavenly home. That's where our citizenship is. That's where our names are registered. That's where our home, our eternal home is. And so while we're here, we consider places home here, don't we? I remember when we first went to preacher training school in Denver, and when we had a break over the summer, we went back home, right? We went back home to Ohio, and we spent a few weeks there. And it didn't take very long to realize that we were only gone for a year, but when we went back, it wasn't the same as it was because when we were there, we were involved in the work. We knew what was going on all the time in that area. We knew what was going on in those people's lives, but we hadn't been that close with them for a year. And when you go back, it's almost like you can't go home again, kind of thing, right? It's different when you go back than what it was when you were there. But we considered that to be home, right? And we've been in East Tennessee now for what, 8.5 years, a little over 8.5 years. So this to us is home, but it's a temporary home, right? No matter where we might be on this planet, it's a temporary home because our heavenly home is there and is waiting for us. And so we have come to that, right? That belongs to us. Our names are recorded there. Our names are registered in heaven. That's waiting for us. It's an inheritance that, according to 1 Peter chapter 1, God is guarding for us. Boy, isn't that a great place to lay up our treasures, where God is there guarding it? Because moth's not going to come in and eat it up. Rust isn't going to corrupt it. Thieves aren't going to break through and steal. If God's guarding our inheritance, how rock solid is that? Now, we can throw it away, right? We can lose it. No one else can come and take it. But we can lose that if we're not faithful. But we've got our names registered in heaven. Did you have something, Jake? We have our names registered in heaven. We've come to God, the judge of all, right? We can go directly, and we talked about this earlier, we can go directly to God. The Hebrews writer brought this up back in chapter 4 and verse 16, that we can boldly come to the throne of grace to ask for grace and mercy in our time of need. Back in the old system, under the Mosaic law, they couldn't go directly to God's throne of grace, right? That mercy seat was representational of God's throne. And it was the high priest who would meet with God. There, God would meet with him between those two cherubim on that Ark of the Covenant. And it was there that they would come. How often was the high priest go into that most holy place? Once a year, right? And what would he do when he went in there? Sprinkle the blood of the sacrifice, right? He'd make atonement for the people. He'd ask for forgiveness of their sins. And so what's he seeking? Well, he's seeking mercy and he's seeking grace, right? For the nation of Israel, for the people. Well, now we can go directly because of the sacrifice of Jesus, because that wall has been torn down, because the veil is no longer there. We can go directly to God in prayer in a spiritual journey, not a physical one. And so we can come directly to God, the judge of all. Now, is God going to judge us at some point? God's going to judge us at some point, right? Jesus is going to be the one who's going to be the judge. Look back at chapter 4 and verse 13, because he's talked about the fact that God's going to judge us at some point. Talking about God, he says there is no creature, in verse 13 of chapter 4, there is no creature hidden from his sight, but all things are naked and open to the eyes of him to whom we must give an account, right? There's going to be a judge. So he's calling back. I don't know if you watch stand-up comedians or anything like that. There's some clean ones out there that are okay to watch, but they'll do a thing that's called a callback, right? Well, they'll tell a joke about something, and then they go on through their act, and then they come to another joke, and they kind of do a callback to that first joke, right? They make a reference back to that first. Well, that's called a callback. Well, he's making a callback here, right? As he's going through this list, he's talking about things that he's already talked about in this sermon. So he's drawing their attention to all the things that he has been talking about throughout this book. We can come directly now to God, the judge of all, and he talked about that in chapter 4, talked about that in chapter 10. We can come with boldness, right? We can come with boldness. To the spirits of just men made perfect, he says. I've got that, I think, as number 7 on my list here, or it's either number 6 or number 7, I'm not sure. It's number next on the list. The spirits of just men made perfect. Well, who are these just men? Well, you got all these heroes of faith in chapter 11. Right? We are in company with all of those heroes of faith that are in chapter 11, because he's dealing with the passage from Habakkuk. My just ones, or my righteous ones, or the righteous shall live by faith. And so he gave all these examples of these folks who didn't just say, well, they believe that God exists, but they lived their lives according to the faith that they had. Right? And so we've come to the spirits of just men made perfect. We are in league, if you will, with them, with all of those heroes that are in chapter 11. And You think about those just or righteous ones who are made perfect. They suffered, they endured, they were faithful, and God testified that they were righteous. And when you look back at Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 40, and talking about all of these folks that are in chapter 11, he says, God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. We've come to what? We've come to the spirits of just men who have been made perfect. Well, what is it that made those just men perfect? The blood of Christ, right? We have something better, but we have not been made perfect apart from them. What makes them perfect is the same thing that makes us perfect. Now, their sins were atoned for. They were forgiven in the past when they offered the sacrifice of those animals because they did what it was that God commanded them to do. And in God's mind, Jesus is the lamb slain from when? The foundation of the world. So in God's mind, right, he exists outside of time. Jesus has always been that sacrifice. And so their atonement, their forgiveness is based on the blood of Christ, even though in our world that hasn't happened yet. Because in God's mind, it's always been that way. And so the Hebrews writer talked about how the blood that Jesus shed wasn't just for us, but was for those who had transgressed under the first covenant. Right? Those who had transgressed under the old Mosaic system, Jesus' blood covers their sins also. And so we're in league with those just men who have been made perfect or been made complete by the blood of Christ, because when we obey God, when we are baptized, when we make contact with Jesus' blood, the same thing is what made them perfect is what makes us perfect or complete. And it doesn't mean that we're going to be perfect and that we're going to be sinless, but that idea of being complete, right? Being whole, being reconciled back to God. Any comments or questions on any of these things? And so you see what he's doing here, how he's weaving these things together that he's talked about before in the letter. And we have come to Jesus, who is the mediator of the new covenant. In verse 24, he talked a lot about that new covenant coming off of the passage from Jeremiah chapter 31, beginning in verse 31, where God says, "Behold, the days are coming when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah." And it's not going to be like the covenant that he made at Mount Sinai when they brought him out of Egypt. It's going to be a different kind of covenant, because in that covenant from Mount Sinai, when they came out of Egypt, what did they have to do every year on the Day of Atonement? They had to offer sacrifices, right? And so on the Day of Atonement, they had to offer a sacrifice. Well, next year on the Day of Atonement, was that sacrifice last year sufficient? What do we got to do this year? Got to offer another sacrifice. When the Day of Atonement comes next year, what do we have to do? Have to offer another sacrifice, right? Because there was always a reminder of sins. There was always a remembrance of sins. The blood of bulls and goats could not cleanse the conscience, Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 11. And so there was something that was lacking in those animal sacrifices. Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 4, the blood of bulls and goats can't take away sin, right? And so there was something insufficient. And so they had to keep doing it over and over and over again. But in the new covenant, God says, I'm going to forgive their iniquities and their sins I will remember no more. There's no longer going to be that remembrance of sins because the blood of Christ takes care of that. Now, did Jesus have to come back the following year and die on the cross a second time? Or come back the following year and die on the cross a third time? No, he only had to do it once, right? And so he's getting back to that idea that he talked about earlier. Yes.
Another thing is to bring up. If the priest, like high priest, had to offer a sacrifice for his own sin before he appeared before the people. But Jesus, it's the sinless offering, didn't have to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Those high priests, before they would go in and offer the atonement for the people, they had to offer a sacrifice for their own sins first, right? Jesus didn't have to do that. He didn't have any sins to atone for. So he was superior, right, to those human high priests. And so everything with Jesus is better. And so he's the mediator of that new covenant. Notice over in chapter 8 and verse 6, where this is where the Hebrews writer starts to pick up on this idea of the covenant. He says, now he has obtained a more excellent ministry, inasmuch as he is also mediator of a better covenant, which was established on better promises. So not only is Jesus the mediator of the new covenant, it's a better covenant, because God's not going to remember our sins anymore. We're not going to have to continually make daily sacrifices or sin sacrifices or trespass offerings or the Day of Atonement. All those sacrifices are done away with, right? So we've got a better covenant established on better promises. Their promise was that if you follow God and do what he wants, then you can live in the promised land, right? You can live in the land of Canaan. Well, that was a physical place, and it was temporary. The promise that remains for us that he talked about in chapter 4 in verse 1, right? There's a promise that still remains for us. They couldn't enter into his rest because they disobeyed in the wilderness. But we can enter into that rest. There's a promise that remains of us being able to enter into his rest in our promised land of heaven. And so it's a better promise. It's an eternal promise. It's not a temporary physical one, but it's an eternal spiritual promise. And so it's a better promise. And so we've come to Jesus, who's the mediator of that new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling that speaks better things than that of Abel. The blood of sprinkling goes back to Hebrews chapter 10, where he talked about how Moses, when he consecrated everything, when he sanctified everything, he sprinkled the blood, right? When the people said, yeah, we'll do what it is that God wants us to do, he killed the sacrifice, he took half the blood, and he poured it out on the altar, and that sealed that covenant between God and his people, sealed it on God's part when he poured the blood on the altar. And then he took the other half of the blood and he sprinkled it on the people. Well, that sealed the deal for them. And so we saw that sprinkling of blood there in Hebrews chapter 10, because that was how they did things in the past. And he's talking about how now Jesus' blood, right? We make contact with his blood when we are baptized back there in chapter 10. Notice. I was going to do it by memory, but it's slipping. Let us draw near, he says in verse 22, with a true heart, in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. He talks about two things there, but they happen at the same time. Our hearts are sprinkled with the blood when we are washed with water, when we are baptized. That's where we make contact with the blood of Christ. And so that sprinkling never talks about the water as in the form of baptism. That sprinkling was always the blood that is referenced in the Old Testament, that the sprinkling of blood. And so we have come to that, right? The blood of sprinkling that speaks better things than that of Abel. Jesus' blood speaks better things than the blood of Abel did. Well, what did the blood of Abel speak for? What is it that he wanted? Well, let's go back and look at Genesis chapter 4 for just a second. What happened to Abel?
His brother killed him.
His brother killed him. His brother was jealous of him, right? Abel had offered a better sacrifice. Cain was angry about that, and so Cain killed him. And when God approaches Cain, when God talks to Cain about what has happened, notice in Genesis chapter 4 and verse 10, God says to Cain, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." Right? Abel's blood was calling out to God because of what Cain had done. Well, what was Abel's blood calling for?
Justice.
Justice, right? Abel's blood was calling for justice. Something has to happen to Cain because Cain's committed murder. And so Abel's blood is calling out for justice. Jesus died on the cross, right? Was put through a mockery of a trial. It was a sham trial. They killed him for no reason. And so is his blood calling out for justice? Boy, God, you got to get those guys that crucified me.
Right.
His blood's grace and mercy, right? Jesus' blood cries out for mercy and grace and forgiveness. Those are better things than justice. When we're wronged, we want justice, but when we do wrong, what do we want? Mercy, right? We want mercy. And Jesus' blood is there. The sprinkling of that blood is not saying, okay, you're condemned now because you've been sprinkled with the blood and his blood's calling for justice. But if you've been sprinkled with the blood, what do you get? You don't get what you earned, right? Because what we earned, the wages of sin is death. We don't get what we earned. We get something else. We get grace and mercy and forgiveness. And so Jesus' blood calls out for better things than the blood of Abel. And so we've come to these and we've come to better things, right, than what they had. And that's the whole point that he's been making through the whole letter. And so he has this, he's summing up here and he's calling back to all the parts of the sermon that he's mentioned previously. And so in verse 25, any comments or questions through verse 24 before we go on? So in verse 25, he says, see that you do not refuse him. See that you do not refuse him who speaks. For if they did not escape who refused him who spoke on earth, much more shall we not escape if we turn away from him who speaks from heaven, whose voice then shook the earth, but now he has promised, saying, yet once more I shake not only the earth, but also heaven. Now this yet once more indicates the removal of those things that are being shaken as of things that are made, that the things which cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us have grace by which we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear, for our God is a consuming fire. So he says there in verse 25, verse 25 is a great verse. If you want to sum up, right, if you wanted like a thesis statement for the whole book of Hebrews, see that you do not refuse him who speaks. Don't refuse what it is that Jesus has spoken. Don't refuse the one who is speaking, because that goes back all the way to the beginning of the letter, right? God, who in various ways and in various times and times past spoke to the fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son. Don't refuse him who has spoken to us in these last days by his Son. In chapter 2 and verse 1, right? Therefore, we must give the more earnest heed to the things that we have heard, lest we drift away. Because Jesus is better than the angels, which the Hebrews writer proved in chapter 1. We have to give the more earnest heed to the things that Jesus has said than the things that the angels reported back in the times of the Old Testament. In chapter 3 and verse 7, today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts like they did in the rebellion. Today, if you will hear his voice. Can we still hear the voice of Jesus today? How? Through his word, right? Through his word, through the word that's been inspired for us to have. He's not going to come back down here and talk to us a second. He's already done that, right? When Jesus comes back, it's going to be for judgment. It's going to be for salvation. It's not coming back a second time to offer a sacrifice for sins. He's not coming back a second time to try to convince us. He's not coming back so that, every eye will see him and now the Jews will convert to set up an earthly kingdom here on earth, right? When he comes back, it's going to be judgment day. So today, if you'll hear his voice, don't harden your heart. Don't do what it is that those Israelites did who fell in the wilderness, right? Don't be like them. Be like Jesus and Moses and be faithful in God's household that he talked about in Hebrews chapter 3. And so God has spoken to us by his Son. So don't refuse him who speaks. For if they did not escape who refused him who spoke on earth, much more shall we not escape if we turn away from him who speaks from heaven. They didn't escape. Now, have we heard that before? Those of you that have been here multiple weeks, if you remember back almost a year ago now, I guess. Now we were in chapter 2 way after that. But back in chapter 2 and verse 3, right? How shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation, which at the first began to be spoken by the Lord and was confirmed to us by those who heard him, right? How shall we escape? Well, he's talked about that. If the word that was spoken through angels proved steadfast and sure, and every transgression received a just recompense or a just reward, how shall we escape? When they messed up in the Old Testament, when they did what God said, don't do that, was there a penalty? Yes. If you read through the book of Leviticus especially, right, you'll see that here's the laws, here's the things that you are to do, here's the things that you are not to do, and if you do the things that you're not to do, well, here's the penalty for it, right? Over here he says, don't commit adultery. And over here he says, well, if you commit adultery, if somebody commits adultery, what was the penalty for that? Death by stoning, right? There was a penalty for that. You weren't to do any work on the Sabbath day, right? They had somebody who was picking up sticks on the Sabbath day, and they weren't sure what it was that they were supposed to do, so they inquired of the Lord, what was the penalty for picking up sticks on the Sabbath day? They stoned him, right? Over here it says that children, you need to be obedient to your parents. You need to follow, you need to honor your father and your mother, right? You need to be respectful for your parents. Well, if you've got a child that's completely unruly, that will not obey its parents and continues to rebel against their parents, there was a penalty for that, right? And so every transgression received a just recompense. Every transgression received a punishment. He says, how much worse do you think it's going to be if you violate the words that Jesus has said? You violate what God has spoken to us by His Son. He says that the punishment is going to be worse if we neglect Him who speaks from heaven. Those in the past didn't escape. We're not going to escape either. Look over at Hebrews again, chapter 10. Now, he talks about willful sin. Now, willful sin is not talking about every sin under the sun, but he's talking about basically turning our back on Christ and going the other way, right? If we turn our back on Jesus and we say, I don't need Jesus' sacrifice, I don't need what it is he's done, I'm a good person, I do what's right. Verse 26, he says, if we sin willfully after we've received the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins. If you walk away from Jesus, who's your only sacrifice for sins, there is no other sacrifice. You can't sacrifice bulls and goats. It's not going to do any good. You could give 50% of your income. It's not going to do you any good if you don't follow Jesus, right? There's no longer a sacrifice for sins, but a certain fearful expectation of judgment and fiery indignation which will devour the adversaries. Anyone who has rejected Moses' law dies without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Of how much worse punishment do you suppose will he be thought worthy who has trampled the Son of God underfoot, counted the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified a common thing, and insulted the Spirit of grace? And then skip down to verse 31. It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. If you think that they got punished when they messed up in the Old Testament, our punishment is going to be far worse if we neglect the great salvation that's been provided for us, if we refuse, right, Him who speaks to us from heaven. And so he's basically saying the same thing here in 12:25 that he had said earlier in other places in the book. This is kind of stand and sing time in the book of Hebrews. Right? If you look at this as being a sermon, he's winding this thing down. He's making his conclusion here. He's coming back to his thesis statement. He's coming back to what the whole book is about. Don't refuse Him who speaks to you, because everything that you have with Jesus is better. So hold on to Christianity. But this is basically, if you want to say, there's an invitation in here, you can say, well, this is the invitation, really, of the Hebrews writer. Don't refuse the one that's speaking. You better pay attention to what it is that Jesus says, because Jesus is better. And those who refused in the past didn't escape. We're not going to escape if we ignore what it is that He says today. Jesus said, make disciples of the nations, baptizing them, and then what? Teaching them to observe all the things that He's commanded. It's important. All those things that He's commanded are important. That we are to observe those things. We are to not refuse Him who speaks from heaven. Comments or questions on verse 25? Again, I love how tight this thing is as a sermon, because he talked about this at the beginning. He comes back to it at the end, right? It all comes full circle. Everything is weaved together. There's nothing extraneous. There's nothing extra, right, that doesn't attach to what it is that he's been talking about, right, that he's left hanging out there. I don't know the word I was looking for, but was that the word? Okay. I guess I was using it correctly. I wasn't sure I was, so I stopped. We have a wordsmith. He can keep me on my toes. So in verse 26, whose voice then shook the earth, right? So again, going back to the then, back at Mount Sinai, right? Back at that physical place, His voice shook the earth. The mountain quaked, right? The people were scared. Whose voice then shook the earth, but now it says He has promised, saying, yet once more, I shake not only the earth, but also heaven. Now this yet once more indicates the removal of those things that are being shaken, as of things that are made, that the things which cannot be shaken may remain. Throughout the book, he's used a bunch of Old Testament passages to get his point across. Well, here he's got another Old Testament passage, comes from the book of Haggai, chapter 2, verses 6 and 7, talking about this, yet once more I'm going to shake the earth and heaven, and I'm going to remove those things that are made, that the things that can't be shaken are going to remain. There are folks who look at this passage and they think that this is talking about the end of time. That when Jesus comes back, he's going to shake the earth, he's going to shake heaven, the earth's going to be burned up with fervent heat, right? All the elements are going to melt, the heavens are going to be dissolved, and we're going to go on to our eternal home, and that's going to be the thing that can't be shaken. And so people will look at this passage and they'll think that this is talking about the end of time. But that's not what he's talking about here. What is it that's been made with hands that he's been talking about throughout the book? What's the physical thing that he's been making all the comparisons to throughout the book of Hebrews? It's the Mosaic system, right? It's the Mosaic system. Talking about them sprinkling the things, when they made the agreement, talking about how the high priest would go into that most holy place once a year, talking about how they consecrated everything with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no remission. All the comparisons that he's made to the physical have been made to the Mosaic system. Because what's going to happen, or what is in the process of happening to the Mosaic system here, as the Hebrews writer writes this in the late 60s AD. What's about to happen?
It's going to be destroyed.
Temple's going to be destroyed, right? So those folks that are still practicing Judaism, those folks that are still offering animal sacrifices, those folks that are still operating as Levitical priests, you still have the genealogical records available to prove that they're from the tribe of Levi. You still have the genealogical records that can prove that the high priest is in the family of Aaron. You still have the temple that is there, where the Temple Mount and the altar of offering that's been there, right, for a long time. Since the time of David, they've been sacrificing right up here in Jerusalem. That's all going to go away in AD 70, right? Those things are going to be shaken. Those things are going to be removed. It indicates the removal of those things that are being shaken as of things that are made, right? All of those things that were there at the temple, who made them? Human beings did, right? Just like when he instructed Moses at the tabernacle, they made all of those things with human hands, right? God doesn't live in a temple that's made with human hands, right? Jesus didn't go into a holy place that was made with hands, but he went into heaven itself, right? The Hebrews writer has talked about this all through the letter, making this comparison between the physical and the spiritual. These physical things, they're going away, right? Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 13 is growing old. It's become obsolete. It's ready to vanish away, right? So this yet once more indicates the removal of those things that are being shaken as of things that are made, that the things which cannot be shaken remain. Well, what is it that cannot be shaken that is going to remain after the Mosaic system is done away with? It's Christianity. It's the church, right? It's the church. Notice in verse 28, therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken. Kingdom's going to be here, right? Kingdom's not going to be destroyed. Because on the last day, when Jesus returns and all those things are destroyed, what's Jesus going to do with the kingdom? What's he going to do with the church? He's going to hand it over to the Father, right? These things that cannot be shaken are going to remain. This kingdom that cannot be shaken reminds me of Daniel chapter 2 and verse 44. Daniel is explaining the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, where he saw the statue, and the stone that was carved without hands hit the statue, and it broke the statue into pieces. It was gone completely. Statue represented 4 kingdoms, right? The head of gold represented Babylon. As the second section represented the Medes and the Persians. The Persian Empire was going to come along after Babylon. The third section represented the Greeks. The Greek Empire was going to replace the Persian. And then the legs and feet of iron mixed with miry clay, that represented the fourth kingdom that was going to come, right? The fourth empire, the Roman Empire. And in Daniel chapter 2 and verse 44, he says, and in the days of these kings, God will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. It's a kingdom that cannot be shaken, right? He's going to do away completely. While you might have a time period where Judaism and Christianity are overlapping, once you get to 70 AD, there's no more overlap. Wherever that overlap ends, right? There's no more overlap, and you need to be a Christian. because Judaism is dead. You need to repent, he says in chapter 6, of dead works, because those things can't save you. Only the blood of Christ can save you. So since we're receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us have grace by which we may serve God acceptably with reverence and fear. Grace. We serve with grace, right? Because God has allowed us to serve him, to serve the living God acceptably. That service, right, which we are to serve, it's talking again about a priestly service, and we saw that priestly service back in chapter 1, verse 7, and talking about the angels. We saw it in chapter 1 and verse 14, talking about the angels, that the angels perform priestly service as well. And so we serve as priests. We serve under Jesus as our high priest. We serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear. We serve God with reverence. We respect him, and we're in awe of his awesome power. Any last minute comments or questions before we break for worship? I almost finished chapter 12. Yes, Sue.
Jews, Orthodox Jews today, explaining the fact that they can't do overnight sacrifices and all that other.
Well, they're doing basically what they did in the synagogues back when they were in captivity in Babylon and they couldn't do the sacrifices, and so they practice their synagogue worship. They believe that at some point the Messiah is coming back and the temple is going to be rebuilt, but that's already happened. The temple's already been rebuilt when they came back from Babylonian captivity. So the prophecies that talked about the temple being rebuilt, those prophecies have already been fulfilled. But they're still waiting for the Messiah. If they don't believe in Jesus, now there are so many different religious groups, and we'll talk about that some tonight. But there's so many different religious groups that are out there that you've got some that consider themselves to be Jews for Jesus, that they're practicing Judaism, but they believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And I don't know how there's a lot of groups out there that teach a lot of different things, and I don't know. Sometimes you can't get there from here, and we'll do a series of lessons at some point on things that people believe that you can't get from here, can't get there from here. But I'm not sure exactly how they, where does their atonement come from, because they can't do that, right? But they're doing what they've done in the synagogues.
Just fast all day, and pray.
They fast and pray. Yeah, I know that some of them, some of them will still partake of the feasts. Like the Passover feast, they'll still go through that. Now they've got a long version of that. They've got a shorter version of that, but they'll still go through the ritual of the Passover meal. Good questions.
I just like the idea of, and you heard this at one, but if we are in Christ, that truly is an at one. We are a physical.
Yeah, we are one with him, right? Yeah. Thanks for your comments. Thanks for your questions.